British intelligence and Irish neutrality during the Second World War. And Professor O'Halpin, I understand you are currently preparing 3 further studies, which include an island at war conflicts, Ireland conflicts 1922-24, and Irish killings and deaths 1922-25. So I think it's clear to say that the professor has a very busy schedule, and to have him here in person is just absolutely appreciated, and it's notable because this is the first guest from Ireland to USP, to Brazil, since the beginning of the COVID period. And I guess, as I hope and I expect, you will be the first of many to walk through the doors and follow those who have walked before into these great doors of Irish studies here at the university. I know that Laura and Munir and our team have been waiting for this moment, so here we are. We're still with the hybrid space and we're still wearing masks, but at the same time there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel at this stage. I could just add quickly before we go into Eunan, I could just make 1 or 2 comments. And Sean mentioned, and St. Patrick's Day is an opportunity for us all to think about Ireland, to think about our culture, to think about our music, our writers, but also our history. And I think over the course of 2022, we hope to, with the consulate and the embassy, hope to offer you more of that with our exhibition in Rio, with the National Library that will look at Ireland's story in Brazil. But it's an exhibition that we will look to bring and bring to USP. We will look to bring to other universities around Brazil, because we feel, and there's currently 60,000-70,000 Brazilians in Ireland. That story is only starting, but it's a very powerful start, and I think it's one that I'm looking forward to being a part of. If I can also say that we have an Irish Corner coming to University of Sao Paulo. We hope to launch that around Bloomsday and the 100 years, and at that stage I think we will also be able to offer you a sense of Ireland's sort of culture, history, etc. And last but not least, and we mentioned greenings. We have and have been greening some of the world's iconic monuments, but this year as a mark of solidarity to those Ukrainians and the people of Ukraine who are just going through untold tragedy and suffering at the moment. And I think, and add to that, while the world is illuminating monuments in green, Ireland is illuminating monuments in blue and yellow. So I think it's important that we have that in our mindset as we go forward. If I can just add key historical events and moments, in particular from the start of the 20th century, and Eunan will know more about this than I. Home Rule, Easter Rising, War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the First Dáil Éireann, Bloody Sunday, the establishment of the Irish Free State and a civil war, and of course literary revival, all of which ensure that 100 years on from that revolutionary period, we are here to commemorate, I guess, and we have been commemorated a decade of centenary. And I think today's event and the opening of the chair this year absolutely is a part of that. Ireland's journey towards independence, definitely not a smooth one, quite the opposite. During what was a pivotal decade in Irish history, there were plenty of leading characters who played critical roles in ensuring Ireland became the Ireland we know today. I'll name but a few: Collins, De Valera, Countess Markievicz, Roger Casement, a name that we'll talk about after this. W.T. Cosgrave and Margaret Pearse are just a few of those. But another name who has become synonymous with this period is, of course, Kevin Barry, a young medical student executed 1st of November 1920 at the age of 18, which inflamed, some would say, inflamed nationalist public opinion in Ireland and attracted much international attention. His death by execution is said to have triggered what was an escalation in violence as the Irish War of Independence entered its bloodiest phase. If I can, and I mentioned to Eunan prior, I did take some of the words from his book, and as described after his death as poor little Kevin Barry, or a plaster saint, many regarded Kevin Barry as an Irish Republican martyr, or a Republican icon, as Professor O'Halpin, grandnephew of Kevin Barry, has remarked in the past. Others have questioned the merit of a book on Kevin Barry at all, with one commentator remarking, and to quote from your book, Professor, "There is really very little to say about Barry, who thought, wrote and did nothing of great significance." Professor, you of course explore all of these ideas and perspectives in your excellent work, Kevin Barry, an Irish Rebel in Life and Death. Your book, together with the book Yours Till Hell Freezes, a memoir of Kevin Barry written by your second cousin and great niece of Kevin, Shifra O'Donovan, represents, I guess, and maybe you'll touch on this, a new historical treatment of your great uncle and portrayal of Kevin and portray Kevin as anything but a little Kevin Barry, but of a lad of 18 summers with plenty of sins to confess and whose significance was in fact great. With that in mind, it really is a pleasure to hand over the microphone, or to slide over the microphone and not have to press pause on the Zoom call, and to hear directly from our esteemed guest today, Professor.
Thank you very much, Eoin. I hope you can all hear me. First of all, Ambassador, Dean, President, colleagues, but particularly Lara and Munira, but especially Lara for inviting me. This is my second occasion at being at USP. There is a proverb, once bitten, twice shy, but Lara hasn't learnt that yet. In talking to a live audience, this is the first opportunity I've had. In fact, I just realised, sitting at the back, this is, I think, the second anniversary of the last time that I was able to talk to a live audience, which was 6 weeks from the end of my academic teaching career. And so for my last six weeks of teaching, I was teaching on Zoom. Or to some extent, in fact, Dahi O'Callaghan, who my students already knew, talking to the students as well. And it was okay, sort of on Zoom, which is better than Microsoft Teams at least, talking to an audience you couldn't see. You couldn't see your familiar faces. You couldn't see your students busy on their phones. You couldn't realise that you were boring or that you were interesting. The lack of eye contact for me was devastating and remains so. So I apologise if I spend most of my time trying to eyeball everyone in the audience, but because it is something I can see the benefits of hybrid teaching. You can teach, I can give a talk here and it can be seen in Ireland, in India or whatever, and that's great. But to lose the eye contact and the personal contact is just enormous, just profoundly shocking. And for my last 6 weeks, I also had to try to learn to use PowerPoint effectively, which is not something in my original contract or my formation. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint today if I get to use it. I'm not very good at timing. And can I pick up in relation to COVID, but also what the Ambassador said? Another important aspect, to some extent, of what I've done professionally, but also in familiar terms, in terms of my family and my family background, is talk to people who knew from the period. Now, as a kid, I met a lot of old IRA men, and I still visualise IRA men as men generally with coats, with ties, with hats, who are quite old, and a lot of Republican women, including my grandmother. I met them, they were wearing fur coats, they weren't unfashionable, or they were wearing leather gloves, and they're generally little old ladies. And I transported these little old ladies back to the Irish Revolution. I'm not saying there are any little old ladies here, you're all so young, but my mental image still is distorted by thinking of the IRA and I met, like Moss Toomey, who was Chief of Staff of the IRA for 10 years, who was a great friend of my Maloney grandparents, my grandmother Kathy Bahey and Jim Maloney. So many of them I met when they were old, and I didn't realise they were once young. Because there is this phenomenon of aging which doesn't affect us, but other people get old. And when you meet them, you don't realise how much they've experienced, how much they've changed, but also how much they felt and how much they know. Now, my wife, Eve Morrison, tomorrow in some ways will be talking about memory and history and oral history, and I should go into it. But one of the terrible losses for me in COVID, I had arranged to talk to a number of friends of my parents, ask them what they were like when they were young and how come this happened and was this true or not, or how did you feel? And most of those people, those that are left, I couldn't talk to because you couldn't possibly. And it wouldn't be the same ringing them up. The whole point is the personal engagement. It's seeing them, it's being given a cup of tea, it's being told things the person wasn't going to tell you on the phone or in an email. And that all went, and most of it I can't recover because they're gone now, and they have, age has taken hold if death hasn't taken them. And again, even before COVID, I'd arranged to go and see a man called Tony Cronin, or Anthony Cronin, who became a very important figure, if you like, in Irish cultural policy in the 1970s, 1980s and 90s especially. But it was Tony Cronin in our family since I was born. And I was going to sort of talk to Tony about my parents, about my Uncle Paddy, who was a great friend, and so on. And I rang him up in October 1916 and said, look, can I come and see you? I want to talk about my parents. And he said, listen, I'm very busy. The older you get, the busier you get. And he said, look, I have a book coming out and whatever. Can we leave this till after Christmas? I said, okay, I'll get on to you in the new year. And of course, the Grim Reaper came knocking and Tony died. So it is, I would appeal to you all in terms of memory, not only political memory or literary memory, but family memory and local memory. You have to talk to those whom you think may carry later on in the talk, if, which is unlikely, I get to the end. Right, and also, in some respect, this is Irish studies, but it's a very naturally, properly, a very literary, if you like, focus. And in some ways, I'm a political and military historian, and also, to some extent, a historian of the British Treasury, so I'm not the right person to be here. But as I say, I didn't make the choice, so I'm quite happy. But I'm going to try to make some links, if you like, between Yeats and the Irish Revolution. And I'm going to, there are particular personal links. On the one hand, there's 1916 and that poem, which we'll get to in a minute. And on the other, there's the practical experience of Yeats's very close collaborator, Lady Gregory, right? And Lady Gregory, in fact, in October 1921, shortly after the Anglo-Irish truce, Lady Gregory is asked and is delighted to give permission for a performance of The Rising of the Moon, and it's being performed by Kevin Barry's old IRA company as a fundraising venture, right? The day after Christmas, 1921, St. Stephen's Day, the Lady Gregory had some neighbours over for dinner and so on, as you do in the holidays. And they're a family called the Baggots, okay? And the Baggots, there's a knock on the door and locals come in to sing called the Wren Boys, who are quite an important cultural trope, sometimes more important culturally perhaps than in practice, but they are supposed to sing a song, the Wren, and the King of the Birds, but they don't know the rest of the words, neither do I. And so what did they do instead? They sing a song. What song do they sing? They sing Kevin Barry. Now in June 1921, outside Gort, very close to where Lady Gregory lived, the Baggots had a tennis party. And 4 people from the tennis party drove down the avenue of their house to the gate, which was locked. In fact, 5 people. And 4 of those people, 2 British Army officers, 1 police inspector, and his wife, Eliza Blake, who was visibly and heavily pregnant, were shot dead by the IRA, in circumstances where certainly the woman could have been spared. And the Baggots had to sit and listen to Kevin Barry, this very sentimental, maundering, powerful song which had already, in a sense, become an instant hit, not just nationally but internationally. And I do wonder how enthusiastically they clapped. So there is a connection. Can we click on to the first, please? Can we click again? Yeah, this is the closing stanza of Yeats's poem 1916. And it ends, of course, with a terrible beauty is born. Now, in some ways, I would argue that this, to some extent, contributes to an implicit romanticization of the 1916 Rising and the way it was conducted, as against the viciousness and so on, implicit viciousness of the Irish War of Independence. And I think this is a rather narrow way to take it. It's to lionize almost the 1916 leaders, because, in a sense, because they were interested in culture. Some of them wrote poetry, some of them wrote plays and so on. The first killing of 1916 was carried out by somebody who was an enthusiastic Abbey actor, Sean Connolly. He shot dead an unarmed policeman in circumstances where they could have just pushed him aside. An act, a theatrical act, you might almost argue, but an unarmed policeman. How heroic is that? So, according to people who were following him in the assisted army unit, they were shocked. They didn't expect this. This isn't what they thought of as legitimate warfare and so on. And of the first 4 civilians, people killed in the Rising, 2 are unarmed policemen, the other killed in Stephen's Green, surrounded by the citizen army. He was unarmed, he could do nothing, but he wouldn't leave, so they shot him dead. And they shot 2 civilians dead who wouldn't help them. So the idea that you have heroic, that violence, if you have a higher purpose, or if you attach it to interesting cultural themes and so on, that simply legitimizes it in a way that implicitly, at least, later violence is not so legitimated because it's not orchestrated by relatively well-educated, relatively urban, relatively metropolitan leadership. I think is a pernicious idea. And I said this in a review of Roy Foster's terrific book, Vivid Faces, in 2014 in the TLS. I think there's a danger in saying there's nice violence and not nice political violence. There's nice rebellion and not nice rebellion. If we look at 1916 critically, it's a period, unlike 1919 to 21, where civilians suffer disproportionately. Well over half of the deaths in the Rising in 1916, we can click on, please. Well, that's Kevin. We'll move one more, please. There's different icons of Kevin, but we can click on one more again. Yeah, to my other book, The Dead of the Irish Revolution. If we look at deaths in 1916, over half of those deaths are civilian, and most of the responsibility for that, you have to say, morally lies not with the British, but with the choice with the rebels, because they decided where they would do their fighting. They picked the General Post Office, which is about 250 yards from the nearest maternity hospital. Right? They picked Stephen's Green, which conveniently has 2 hospitals at the time. Harcourt Street, which has 1 children's hospital, and so on. They located the rebellion by accident, in some ways you could argue, but just where most of the casualties were going to be, particularly in the north side of O'Connell Street or Sackville Street. Those were where the poor lived in enormous numbers in tenements. And in some ways you could say 1916, a terrible beauty is born. In some ways you could say Sean O'Casey, who tends not to be mentioned in the decade of commemorations, who is like Yeats, a Protestant and an Irishman, but he's an inner city working class Protestant. And he renders that line, a terrible beauty is Borneo. In other words, come on. And I think there's merit in both, and we shouldn't romanticize. And that's what Munir's terrific talk. I mean, I'm humiliated by my lack of knowledge and understanding of James Joyce, but it's been greatly appreciated, increased by what you said there. We have to pick our heroes carefully, and heroines carefully, or perhaps understand in general terms rather than focusing on one particular group, be it Kevin, be it Patrick Pearse or whatever. And I'd say in relation to what the ambassador said, and Munir has touched on too, in terms of the Ukraine, if we don't look at the Russians, if we don't try to understand what drives them, and not just Putin, but what drives an ordinary, let's say, a Russian NCO whom we would discover, lets his men or tells his men just kill that bloody house because there's fire coming from nearby. What use will it be? So simply, yes, valorize the Ukrainians, but also understand that some of the people doing these terrible things, and they're conducting this terrible war on the other side, that they are doing it not simply because Putin tells them, but because they believe in a greater Russia, that they have their own narrative, they have their own great writers, they have their own great poets and artists. So I think in all of this, we have to be careful. And I would say in relation, I'm glad you mentioned my cousin Schieffer's book on Kevin Barry. Schieffer and I were going to jointly write a book, but we did such different approaches that we agreed to do books separately. Because I'd wanted to avoid the topic altogether because it intersects so much with family memory. And in Schieffer's own history, her family's history too, her connection to Kevin Barry, mine is through my grandmother, Cathy Barry, Kitby, whom we'll hear a lot of in what I say. Hers is through her father, Donald O'Donovan, and his mother, Monty, who was one of Kevin Barry's younger sisters. And Monty, at the age of 20, married a man of much older, rather older, about 8 years old, called Jim O'Donovan. And Jim O'Donovan was fixated with Kevin. He was a very he was a very intelligent man. He was, in some ways, you could call him a public intellectual almost in the 1930s, when he published quite an important magazine for some years. While working professionally. But Jim O'Donovan was the person who forged the IRA's links with Nazi Germany. And not only and that wasn't simply nationalist opportunism, England's enemy is Ireland's friend, it was also to some extent, in Jim O'Donovan's case, ideological. And yet, when it came to talking about Kevin and writing about him, he wrote about him in the most mawkish, sentimental, uncritical, unanalytical terms. So wherever you go, there's connections. And wherever you go, you have the difficulty of separating the familial from, if you like, from the wider political perspective. And I suspect that's as true in Ukraine. After all, President Putin tells us they're all Nazis. right? Why are they Nazis? Well, of course, they're not. But the argument is that many Ukrainian nationalists looked to Nazi Germany for salvation against the Soviet Union after 1941. But of course, President Putin doesn't remind us that between 1939 and 1941, Germany and the Soviet Union were allies, not opponents. So it's a complicated world, and in some ways, the more we realize the complications, and the complications facing individual actors in it, the more I think we can understand. And finally, can I say, in the focus on the Irish Revolution and so on, I mentioned that the majority of deaths in the 1916 Rising are civilian deaths. But in the Irish War of Independence, not the majority, but a very large minority of all civilian deaths occur in Belfast. And they occur to a considerable extent because people in Belfast, not nationalists, but we call them loyalists, formed the view that they were under threat, right? And when it comes to the Civil War, which is mentioned, I'm doing now a death-by-death study of, which is in some ways morbid, but very enlightening and frequently surprising. But I would be very surprised when I finish that work of looking at every death and trying to contextualize. If more civilians haven't died in Belfast in 1922 than die in the, quote, Irish Civil War of 1922 to 23, yet civil wars are meant to be about, in a sense, civilian deaths, right? Our Civil War, which my grandparents played important parts on the anti-treaty side, was almost entirely a fight, in a sense, between friends, and to some extent even brother against brother. My grandfather, my great uncle, was Deputy Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA. His half-brother, because my great-grandmother married twice, so her youngest son was a flying officer during the First World War, an Irish airman, didn't foresee his death, and then he joins the Free State Army. So you have the brother he's fighting on the other side, if you like. So that old cliche applies even in my family history. Okay, so I've mentioned the dead. And what's interesting about the dead, can I just click on a bit? This probably isn't, these two diagrams are probably hard to follow, but they're probably less hard now because of COVID. We're used now to looking at deaths, not just as numbers, but as proportions of population. And what's dramatic about the two of them, these are from the proofs of the book. I'm sorry, I had it on my laptop. I should have got the original, but the book is too heavy to bring with me. Measuring the proportion of dead deaths and so on. If you do 1916 to 21, the place that suffers the most deaths, it's still a relatively very small number in relation to population, is Dublin. If you do 17 to 21, it's Cork. But what's interesting in terms of the development of Irish nationalism and republicanism in the 20th century, that most of the places, with the exception of Belfast, which is County Antrim, we did it by county, most of the places that suffered the least, you've got Tyrone, which we would think of now as a very bitterly divided, politicised county in Northern Ireland, but it's the least violent if you count deaths at the time, right? Donegal, which again is a pretty Republican county now, in many ways in ethos and in electoral terms, in terms of Sinn Féin's strength. Donegal, very little, very few deaths, and so on. Do you see the point? So something's happening in the narrative over the course of the period from 1922 on, where political death shifts northwards, if you like. But I think it's very striking. County Cavan, which is a border county, and again would be considered as quite a Sinn Féin stronghold, I think there's 11 deaths in Cavan in the entire revolutionary period that I can link to politics. There is one British soldier fatally wounded, but he dies in Dublin, and he's shot by a comrade who's tried for manslaughter. And yet Cavan sees itself is projected as having a strong Republican history. You see the oddities. Carlow, where Kevin is from, a tiny county, and there are a total of 13 deaths in that county in the period. Not many. That's to say, civilians who were accidentally shot or shot as spies. The IRA killed 3 people as spies. The majority of civilians whom the IRA killed during the War of Independence are alleged civilians, are alleged spies, right? You have a couple of policemen, you have 1 or 2 soldiers. But really, it's 13, and it's the 5th out of 12 Leinster counties, it's the fifth most violent if you measure by deaths. So the Irish Revolution is very uneven where the Grim Reaper actually comes. And you can't map it onto to contemporary politics, because it isn't that simple. And I'll get on to the next slide in a minute. To give you an illustration of the 11 deaths in Wicklow over this period, effectively we're in Wicklow 1920 and 21. Two of those deaths occur when if you're looking for causes, not just political causes, but perhaps sectarian causes, or in rural Ireland, agrarian causes, right, where landlords are figures of hate and so on, large farmers and landlords. You have a large farmer killed and is shot dead in his house. He's Protestant, a member of the Church of Ireland, so you'd say, well, maybe he was targeted for that reason. He's a large landowner, maybe he's targeted for that reason. And thirdly, he's a JP, which is an unpaid, kind of the lowest level of the judicial system, really for dealing with drunks or for people who, whose dogs bite other people, which is left in the British system was left to unpaid dignitaries rather than to paid judges. And you think, he's at night attacked by two men. There's a scuffle. He's shot dead. The two men who attack him aren't, as you might think, either local small farmers or labourers who envy him his land. They're not robbers who want his money. They are robbers who want his money, rather. But they're policemen. They're two this new police force, element of the police known as the Black and Tans, who have just arrived in the town, get drunk, and decide we'll go out and rob somewhere. And they end up killing him. And one of those two, ironically, is the only person actually executed, a member of the Crown Forces, either police or military. And he's executed in Mountjoy Jail for murder during the Irish War of Independence. Although there's clearly many others who could have been treated that way. So we have to be really careful in attributing particular reasons for particular events and so on. Okay, can we click on? I will get to Kevin at some point. Yeah, just to talk a little bit, just to explain who Kevin Barry was. I'm sorry, I'm presuming a lot of knowledge which you don't have. Kevin Barry was an 18-year-old medical student. He was at the end of his first year in UCD, which he had failed. He hadn't turned up for an examination in June because he was out on an IRA operation, and he would probably have failed again. Now, this is typical the history of medical students. Some of the doctors who may have, if you're Irish, who may have, delivered you, looked after your mother. It's almost an honourable history. My two sisters are an example of this, which pertained, I'd say, until the 1980s, that you would fail a year or two in medicine, but you would go on to complete it. Right, but Kevin was almost 19 when he was executed. When I started thinking about it, when I started writing this book, he wasn't all that young when he was executed, and he was far more experienced than most IRA volunteers in terms of actual operations where you carried a weapon. And in some ways, what shocked me when I thought about it some more, if you look at the occasions where he actually used a weapon. One was in a raid on a house which had belonged to John Redmond, who was the great political leader of Irish nationalism, who had achieved home rule, of a kind, but with the 1914 Government of Ireland Act, but who died discredited in national size in 1918 because of the Rising and then of subsequent events. But they were raiding Redmond's house in Wicklow, either with the idea of burning it down or of searching for weapons. And Kevin apparently leads the crash into the house where he's confronted by a man with a poker, and he has a gun. The man has the poker. The man with the poker puts it down, and they don't burn the house, but they could have. They're persuaded by Redmond's daughter not to do so, and they find some guns and they leave. His second big operation, Carlo, is when the IRA would raid houses for weapons. Now, by definition, by 1920, any sort of Republican houses, the police in there and got what weapons there were. Because every house had a shotgun, every rural house, right? It wasn't considered a weapon. It's just a necessary instrument of rural life. But amongst the places they raid is the house of a Protestant clergyman, right? The Church of Ireland rector of Tullow. And he has a shotgun, and we know that because he shoots at them. So what do? They shoot back. And had they killed him, that would naturally have been constructed by the Protestants of Wicklow, Tullow's and Wicklow rather than Carlow, as being a sectarian attack. You know, if I go and shoot somebody's pastor or somebody's rabbi or somebody's imam, nobody's going to believe, actually, I was just going to rob his money or take his gun or burn his house down. It was nothing personal, nothing religious. And yes, so Kevin had done, and he had done other in some ways, things which in some ways are presented, tend to be presented in the narrative as just kind of boyish things, but these are things that men do. And most of the killing in the Irish Revolution, whether it's by the IRA, whether it's by the police, well, some of the police were a bit older, whether it's by the military, because Kevin in the end is sentenced to death in October 1920 for being involved in the killing of 3 British soldiers in September 1920. And that's when, the song and the sympathy for him is focused very much on 2 things. It's focused on his age. The song goes, just a lad of 18 summers, but actually he was nearly 19. He was the end of first year in university. He didn't see himself as a boy. Of the soldiers he killed, one was barely 20, one was barely 19, and one was 15, right? They were killed in an ambush. The intention wasn't to kill anybody, it was to steal their guns, because they were collecting bread from a bakery. And like many such operations, particularly where you've got guns, there's a mess up, somebody fires a shot who shouldn't, then everybody starts shooting. And the net result is Kevin is captured because his gun jams. He jammed 2 or 3 times. He almost certainly killed one of the 3 young men who died. And to emphasize the unusualness of this, the British Army had lost, I don't think they had lost a single soldier to violence in Dublin in the year until that very morning. And what happened that morning, 2 other soldiers are killed in a barracks in Dublin. They're killed by a drunken comrade, right, whom they try to disarm. He's brought a woman in, which he shouldn't have done. He had her in for a couple of days, which tells you about discipline and morale. And when he wants to shoot her, his comrades get in the way and he shoots them, and then they get the gun off him. So it wasn't that Ireland, that Dublin was a sort of a war zone at the time in the sense of practical deaths. But I mean, Kevin is caught. He's the first person caught, provable that he has been involved in what the Crown regard as murder, and he gets a very fair court-martial in which he won't take part. My grandmother in particular, I think she felt guilty about this. She strongly urges him not to. She urges him continuously not to engage with the legal process and so on, other than limited extent with a solicitor who's a kind of not an court advocate, but is a legal representative. And I think in some ways and this must explain her fixation almost with her dead brother thereafter. Anyway, so Kevin is executed. And in the controversies, can we click on? Yeah, and one more. The fact of this young man's execution goes around the world. I've chosen here, you'll have to excuse me, I went, my Portuguese is as bad as almost every other language I don't speak. But I went on the website of the National Museum of Brazil, and I did find a newspaper archive, and I clicked through it. And these are just examples. They're all from Rio papers. I've cut out the caption of sorry, my technical failings of the top right one, but you can see on each of them, Kevin. So Kevin is being mentioned, right, around the world. He's mentioned not only in the Dominions. There's lots in Australia, there's lots in America, and Canada, obviously, but they're British Dominions. But he's registering in Brazil, he's registering in Argentina, he's registering in Europe. And that's partly because, for several reasons. One is, I sense, the imagery. The pictures that the family had to circulate were one of him in that sports jersey, which is from Belvedere College. We've heard of, Belvo, as we know it, James Joyce attended. So it's out of the Jesuit colleges. It's the high schools, if you like. It's the second most prestigious one in Ireland socially. My grandmother, her husband Jim Maloney, and his brothers went to Mungret, which is an unimportant Jesuit school in rural Ireland. She didn't even ever mention it. But the point about that picture of Kevin in that strike thing is that he looks, for all the world, like thousands of young men who had died from Britain, of the officer class, who went from public school, from Eton or Harrow or Winchester, but who went out and died in the Western Front. So there was, independent of politics, there was this terrific register. Also the fact that he's a sportsman, right? I don't think it would have been as effective if he'd been a sort of a brooding poet or something. Neither would have been effective if he'd been just a cowherd, you know, a young man from rural Ireland, you know, with a funny old hat and a rough old shirt. Do you know? I don't think there would have been the same sympathy. He looked like an icon. He looked, do you see what I mean? He's a middle class, and also he's a medical student, so there's social capital. Do you see what I mean? There's a lot of things at play in terms of how Kevin is projected. And the iconography is very important. As I say, he reaches at least Rio de Janeiro. I'm not sure about Sao Paulo, but you know, he's got there now. He won't complain. He had a great sense of humor, I must say. He's a most engaging young man, but he's a young man, and he's a young man willing to kill, and if necessary to kill not just a soldier in arms, but if he's told to kill a civilian, I'm sure he would have done it. Right? So can we go on? There he is again. Yeah, we just go back to that, can we? You can see that's one of a number of these kind of sports photographs that get circulated. And in my book, I chose that, which is based not on it's based on a piece of street art, which is an artist called Canvas. Did it in, I think, in 2016 or 17. He did it on a wall near Belvedere where Kevin went to school. And so I think it's terrific. I think the cover's not the book, but the cover is terrific for that reason, because in some ways it's quite modern and so on. And the image, if we can click on, yeah. If you take Che Guevara, go on, click one more. A couple of other examples of iconography, how important. Che Guevara, as we know, is a South American revolutionary icon or terrorist, take your pick. Have you heard of him? Che, of course, is an abbreviation of the Irish name Seamus, as we know, which is why we have him. But he, of course, had an Irish connection through his mother. But on the left, I was in JNU in Delhi in 2012 for 3 months. And then, not now, because the BJP have taken over and they've taken over the universities in a very nationalist way in India. But there were pictures everywhere of this man with a slouch hat and moustache called Bhagat Singh, who in 1931 was executed for killing a British policeman. Of course, as these things go, he actually killed the wrong policeman. Now, Bhagat Singh was a revolutionary socialist, right? And yet, now, if you look for images of Bhagat Singh, if you look, for example, the centenary of his birth, who speaks, who congratulates him as a martyr, a Shaheen, I think is the term? Mr. Modi of the BJP, who's the Indian Prime Minister. A lot of the time, the image of Bhagat Singh is now taken. Sometimes he's wearing a turban because he was a Sikh rather than a straight Hindu, and sometimes they colour it in saffron, which is the BJP, you know, the very right-wing nationalist Hindu India colour. So icons get claimed by different groups for different purposes. So here's a man who, at his death, believed in socialist revolution. Right, and certainly wasn't attracted to Hindu nationalism. He wasn't, you know, he was critical of Congress because Congress were non-violent. And yet, of course, the history of the Indian independence movement is the history of non-violent protests. Most of the violence in the independence movement came from the British and Irish who were working for the British, not from Indian nationalists. But the few perpetrators of political violence in Indian nationalist history are now being taken forward as though they were the ones who won independence, which itself is interesting, but I know it's not part of this talk. I better go on. Can we click on? And if you look what happens in appropriation, there's a stamp, and click on again, and the third one. And this is appropriation. Kevin in 1970 gets a stamp on his the 50th anniversary of his death. Now, the stamp is produced, obviously, by a Fianna Fáil government, led by Jack Lynch, who wasn't connected, the first Irish Prime Minister not to be connected by family or background with the Irish Revolution. But his dominant predecessor was one Eamon de Valera, my grandmother would never speak to after de Valera went into conventional politics, though she'd been very close to him. And it's a very Irish thing that well, you give Kevin. In India, Bhagat Singh gets appropriated by Congress. That, I think, is quite early in Indian independence, but they're appropriating a physical force person, a revolutionary socialist who was completely against them politically. Do you see what I mean? But it's about nationalism. And finally, there's an Irish stamp for Che Guevara. Did you know that? In 2017, produced by a government led by, I think in many ways, a very able Taoiseach who surprised the world that he got us out of the terrible financial crisis of 2010 to 2012. Enda Kenny, but Enda Kenny politically is from a party which was founded by the only man that you can genuinely say was an Irish fascist, General Ono Duffy, whose movement, the Blue Shirts. Right? If you start a political party, a political movement, and you pick a colour of shirt, there's always a message there. So you have the leader of what has been the conservative stream in Irish politics, of his government, quite happily doing a stamp for a South American revolutionary socialist. But of course, Che Guevara has something in common with Kevin, in that they were both medical students, although Guevara at least had qualified. Can we click on? Now, where does Kevin register internationally? And I think it's very interesting, from the 60s on, Kevin becomes an international motif, not in terms of political memory, but because of the growth of folk music and an interest in folk music generally. Right? And so you have, on the top, you Paul Robeson, the great, if you like, left-wing American, black American singer. He releases a cover of the song Kevin Barry. Leonard Cohen does a cover. He's a bit dodgy on the historic. He gets his dates wrong and so on. He says 1916, but nobody's perfect. But Leonard Cohen is pretty cool, as I'm sure you'd all agree. And can we click one more? Boy George, I don't know if any of you know him, of Culture Club and so on. He actually sang, to my amazement. I was watching a clip on looking for it. He was on a program, one of these programs where you discover who your ancestors are, right? And it turned out his great uncle or his great aunt was a cousin or something of a man who was executed in 1921 in Mountjoy Jail. So Boy George sings the song Kevin Barry. It's just amazing. But it's very pluralist and very fluid. I'm sure all please. And finally, click on one more. Yeah. ABBA did not cover Kevin Barry, but Bjorn Evelius, who's one of them, he's the chap on the left. Before he decided that he would sing alongside women, he was in a group called the Hootenanny Boys, a Swedish folk group in the early 1960s. And to my amazement, I didn't know this. YouTube is wonderful. This profound historical research. I found a clip which has now disappeared of a television clip of the Hootenanny Boys singing Kevin Barry in 1964. I don't think it was a big hit in Stockholm. I think he decided maybe there are better ways. Mamma mia, there's better ways of making money. Can we click on? There was a pub. Sadly, in 2019, it closed in Savannah, Georgia, called the Kevin Barry Bar. And I had planned to go there, get a free meal, and so on. I have a T-shirt from it, which has Kevin Barry on the front and an Irish pikeman from the 1798 rebellion on the back, which my sister bought me many years ago. But it closed not because the pub was unpopular, but because the man with the lease was retiring, and so it's gone. But there is a kind of international register for Kevin. It's partly to do with the song. The song is not a beautiful song, but it's easy to sing, and it's easy to memorize. And I think that's been important. Can we click on? Yeah. Now, where did I learn about Kevin? And this is, in some ways, the benefits and the limits. First of all, of family links, but also of age. My grandmother, Kathy Barry, was Kevin's eldest sister, and she assiduously defended him when he was in prison, and defended his reputation as she saw it thereafter. But it's interesting that even her accounts of his death change over time, right? And they change partly because maybe memory changes, but also they change in terms of what other people said. And ho-hum, my story can't be quite right. And she was very, very careful, but also very protective of what people wrote about Kevin. She wrote what she considered a definitive version for what was called the Bureau of Military History, which collected the memories of revolutionaries in the 1940s and 50s. And she policed his memory very carefully. But that inevitably led into inconsistencies in detail sometimes, which I'm sure she wouldn't have think. But all she really ever spoke to us about, she was an interesting grandmother. Mainly I saw her in bed, right, because she had a very bad leg. It turned out, I only discovered while writing the book, that she wasn't bedbound. She always went to bed when she had visitors, at least her little grandchildren, right? But she actually could get up and move around if she wished. But there you go. You don't know everything about your grandparents that you think. But I always thought of her as this old lady, bedridden old lady, dealing with her brother, in 1920, going to see her brother in jail, and so on. It just never occurred to me that she was once young and quite glamorous. Right, although she was quite glam in her later years as well. What strikes me, how am I doing on time, Chair? Oh my God. What strikes me is the sheer selectivity of family memory. Because we better click on. There she is again in 1920. There's a kind of celebrity that goes with being of the Barry family especially. I was once introduced, I was giving a talk at a Fianna Fáil think-in in Tullamore in County Offaly, and the chairman, who was called Blaney, a youngish Fianna Fáil TD, who was no interest in me despite my Donegal name, said the only interesting thing about this man is that, I thought he was going to mention one of my books, is that he's a grandnephew of Kevin Barry. And suddenly everybody who was asleep went, right, as though this is my personal achievement. My grandmother in 1922 goes to America with Consul Markovich, and again, limitations of memory. In the 60s, she told Anne Mareko, one of Markovich's biographers, that they got on great. She told her daughters, my mum and my aunt, that Markovich was terrible to her, and she did all the work and Markovich did all the credit and never said thank you. So there's the difference between public history and private history. And in 1924-25, immediately after her marriage, she goes to Australia to raise money for De Valera's anti-treaty notional Republican government. So she got celebrity out of it, and you'll find her all over the newspapers, even in the Civil War where she escapes from jail. It's mentioned across the world because the news agencies do this. Can we clip on? Also her sister Elgin, who's quite different. My grandmother talked about Kevin all the time, in some ways luxuriated in her dead brother. Her younger sister Eileen, or Elgin, never spoke to her children about Kevin. It was too painful. But she did do before she married, and she married the son of the O'Reilly, who was killed in 1916, so there's all that sort of connectivity there. But she did go to raise money for the anti-treaty side. This is an example, which I don't think has been seen before, of a bracelet she was given in 1929. She was in America in 28, 29, raising money for St. Ita's, which was the school established in Cork by Mary and Annie McSweeney, sisters of Terence McSweeney, whose hunger strike in October 1920 arguably had more impact internationally, certainly than Kevin's death did, because hunger striking is such a brave, pacific way to die and to protest. Can we click on? But go back one. There's again, just quickly, there's me. I was amazed at this when I found it, because you'll realize that the very young person, you probably recognize it by my feet, on my grandmother's knee, is me. But the funny thing is, my grandmother wasn't a tactile granny at all. It's interesting. I was amazed that she actually held me. She never did that, because she was too busy, I think, indoctrinating us into the Kevin version of history. There again, I was down in Kevin's homestead in Carlow in 2017, and there was mention of a lock of hair. And the lock of hair had been returned to Kevin's brother Mick, who had joined the IRA at the same time as Kevin, in fact earlier than Kevin, down in Carlow, but again was never mentioned because he survived. And he was always Kevin Barry's brother, but he actually had taken a bigger risk because he was the earner for the family, because he ran the farm. But this was something, and Mick Barry's son, Kevin, said, oh yeah, when he showed it to me, he said, this is called a lock of hair. But it wasn't a lock of hair. That's a lot of hair. That's hair that they cut off some unfortunate girl, probably for talking to a policeman or being seen smiling at a soldier or something. So probably in Carlow, if you did the DNA, you might find the descendant of that unfortunate young woman. So brutality, however noble the cause, isn't all on one side and so on. Now, my grandmother never mentioned the lock of hair, not that she would have cared. scared because the enemies of the Republic are the enemies of the Republic. But I was kind of shocked at the physical nature, because why would a young man keep a lock of thing that's clearly been sheared? It wasn't a sort of an "I love you" lock. It's a very strange. Anyway, but again, go on. Sorry. And again, just to mention what my grandmother didn't do, that's the first Dáil in January 1919, those members who weren't in jail, and I've crudely put an arrow there to show my grandmother, Kathy Barry, or Kitby Barry, her husband Jim, his father is in the first Dáil. By then he'd already been in jail twice. He was in jail again. He was, as a man of 50, he was in jail on hunger strike for 23 days. My grandmother never mentioned her father-in-law, even though he had this interesting political background, even though he voted against the treaty. He just wasn't significant. She never mentioned her brother-in-law, Paddy, my grandfather's youngest brother. The first time I heard about Paddy's death, I asked my grandfather, 10 years after my grandmother died, I said, "What about Paddy Maloney?" And he told me in very clipped terms, because he didn't talk much. My grandmother did the talking, and she did the curating of family memory. So all his family memory, his family home was burnt in November 1920, not a mention. His brother killed, not a mention. His brother Con being deputy chief on the anti-treaty side, never mentioned. Kevin, what happened with Kevin, I'm not debunking Kevin, but it crowds out, because he is the brand, in a sense, that you want to project. You can't have other icons on the same page, because it would distract or whatever, and perhaps qualify. Nor did my grandmother ever mention her brother-in-law Jim O'Donovan's Nazi links, or let alone condemn them. So what you get from memory is really interesting, and you don't get it from the records. But it's also very problematic. Do we have anything? And just back, go forward, sorry. There's a 100th anniversary commemoration for Paddy Maloney outside Tiptown. We kind of obeyed I went down because my mum would have expected it. We obeyed the COVID rules, sort of, But the interesting, that was a local commemoration. There were no politicians at it. There was no Sinn Féin, who don't take part in commemoration unless they run them at it. It was nearly all locals. Very interesting, and some relatives on the Maloney side whom I never met, because there was a big family split, not to do with the Civil War, but to do with money. Dinero in Spanish, I don't know what it is. But families are like that. Who cares about politics? It's who gets the cash. Can we click on? That's just Kevin's last letter. We probably don't have time to write it, but this is the original, which was sold controversially for something like €75,000 at auction by a relative. I think the reason for selling it was to raise money to invest for a very disabled relative. I think it was vulnerable, but it's controversial within the family that this would have happened. But the great thing is, it's a very humorous letter. He writes. I do quote it in here. I don't have time because I'm going to be deplatformed in a second. But he writes in very humorous terms. And he's writing to a girl who he obviously likes. He ends as he wishes her all the best in life and love. He writes a very rounded thing. He says the people here are all great, meaning his prison officers and so on. And he writes with humour. He writes about Halloween, which is in Ireland the day before All Saints' Day, 31st of October, is known as Halloween. And traditionally you eat fruit and you eat nuts and so on. And he says, well, I liked my Halloween rations, but I miss the nuts. So he's trying to be humorous and not sort of courageous. He says a person like me would be expected to make a speech, something like a speech from the dock. Like the prisoner says, I did this for Ireland, I die for Ireland, I'm happier to die for Ireland than to live under British rule, or words to that effect. Whereas he said, no, nobody, if I did that, he says, none of my friends would believe that I'd written it in the first place. So he's very human and quite mature. And also what interests me about him is not just that he chases girls, but he's able to communicate with women. And I think that comes ironically. He was very close to my grandmother, Kitby, the eldest of the family. And when her father died, she kind of took over. Her mother delegated a lot of authority to her. And he was really able to, unlike most Irish men, including me, he was able to relate to women, as not just in a, can I dance with you kind of thing, but he was able to relate to them as people. And the idea of that in itself is a revolutionary concept for an Irish Catholic male, that women might be people too. Can we just go on one more? And finally, well, that's just to mention, on the 100th anniversary of his execution outside Mountjoy Jail, Eve and I were there, but nobody else was. We were within the 5 km limit from where we live, so no laws broken. But it was very strict. You couldn't travel more than 5. And so there was no, I expected that there would be at least a Sinn Féin sort of Republican thing to claim the memory and so on. There was nobody. Except, to our amazement, 2 prison officers came out and raised the Irish flag, put it to half-mast and saluted, which I thought was terrific. And also, it was implicitly the Irish state claiming a dead Republican rather than the Republican movement, which I rather like. And then in the world of coincidence in which I live, we were taken inside the jail. This is a high-security jail. And the fellow said, "Do you want some breakfast?" And so they took us through the ring of steel and just said to them, "Oh, she's all right." We didn't go through any body checks or anything. And by chance, in there, one of the prison officers came over to us, who is the partner of Sinead Barry, so he's the partner of Kevin Barry's great niece, and he's just on duty by chance, so he came over. So Ireland's a small place, but the world's a small place when it comes to links. And can I finally end with some poetry? Yeah, I want to go back. Yeah, well, you can do the. This is a poetry book from 1915, ideal book of poetry for the young. It was prepared for the pupils of St Mary's College in Dublin, which was a secondary school that Kevin went to for a year, but then it shut down. So then he went to Belvedere for 2 years, which was lucky because it enhanced social cachet. You know, being educated by the Jesuits always helps. I'm a Jesuit boy. Look what it's done for me. Can we click on? And I don't know, you mightn't be able to see it there, but the point about this says several things about Kevin. One is that he's quite irreverent. He writes on his books. Now, I don't know about you, but when you had school books, not you young people because you have tablets now, but you weren't meant to write on school books. And there was an economic as well as a discipline thing about that, because typically your school books were sold on. Do you see what I mean? To the next class and the next class, so thereby reducing the cost and so on. But Kevin, obviously, because he was the favourite son, he went to university. The other guy got to mind the farm. But Kevin wasn't like that. And one of the things he writes, I don't know if you can read it on the left-hand side. This is sometime before June 1916, before the end of he writes, "God strafe England," excuse my German. You know, God strike Germany. God strike Germany down. So he's already writing very nationalist, very separatist things, even though most of the people, the boys of St. Mary, say 2 or 3 years ahead of him, would already be in the First World War, fighting on the British side. Most of the boys of Belvedere, right, who lost, I think, nearly 100 boys in the First World War, were fighting for the British, because that's what Catholic middle-class people did. The same for my unfashionable, the Maloney brothers who went to Mungret. Most of their peers were in the British Army, right? As was their other half brothers I mentioned, the flying officer. So there's a huge shift in the way. And finally, and this is the last. I don't know if you can read the contents because this is a W.B. Yeats function, if you like. But I was relieved to discover that the second last poem in this selection, very partisan and nationalist but not violent collection of poetry by a priest, Holy Ghost Father priest, the second last poem in the book, and presumably Kevin read it, and he annotated a lot of these books. This book, by the way, is in the Linen Hall Library in Belfast. I gave it to them many years ago after the IRA tried to firebomb the place, but the second last poem is The Lake Isle of Innisfree. And like Yeats, I will arise and go now. And thank you all for listening to me. Goodbye.
What can I say? I think you started by saying that you could have sat and listened to Professor Moutran for the rest of the day. I think I could sit and listen here to you, Professor, for the rest of the day. And I encourage anybody who hasn't to read this book. It will definitely dive deeper into some of the areas that the professor has spoken about. I, for one, to start a stamp collection. I never knew of such stamps existed. But I think, just if I can just sum up very quickly, and conscious of Laura, I think for me, the importance of conversation, of talking to people, of telling stories, of sharing stories with ourselves, with our brothers and sisters, with family, as we're sharing the story here today, is just a crucial part of history, and especially a crucial part of history whose narrative and story changes as people's story changes, or people's story becomes more relevant or more prominent in the conversation. I think we've heard about stamps, graffiti art, the whole area of iconography or projection of Kevin Barry, the paintings, the pubs, the photos, songs, motifs, and of course poetry. And I think, I would love to know, and if I had time to ask you this question, and maybe I'll ask you afterwards, what the young, as you say it, the not so young Barry would say to all of it. And what would he think, or how would he feel? Because I think, as you said at the start also, there are people out there fighting in a tragic circumstances across Ukraine for very real reasons to their own. And I think it's really on point in terms of how you said it. If I can also just add, you did get your free breakfast in Mountjoy Jail, but I really want to say thank you on behalf of everybody. I think here, I think it was a really captivating conversation, really compelling, and for me, it brought me back to my days in UCD, sitting in the lecture halls, listening to those who just knew how to tell the history of moments in a wider history in such a compelling way. So just to say thank you, Professor. I know that you're here for a few days, and I hope that we'll get talk again. And I know that your wife Eve will speak tomorrow. So once again, thank you for your presence. Thank you for making the journey to being part of it. Because as you said at the outset, presence and people together is how we learn and share. And I think you've done that excellently today. So thank you so much, Professor.
Curiosity from your presentation of the País coming from our newspapers. We are participating in a project internationalizing the Irish revolutions in Latin America, so Latin American Ireland. And here Anna Carolina is the one who is raising all this material from the newspapers, from our newspapers. And this is another name that we can put in our list, Kevin Barry, as in which way he was seen from Latin America. So thank you very much for raising that.